In 1983, a rising rock band boarded a private jet for what was supposed to be the biggest night of their lives and vanished mid-flight without a trace. No distress call, no wreckage. For nearly 2 decades, silence. Then, in 1999, the Navy made a discovery off the coast of Washington that rewrote everything. What they pulled from the ocean wasn't just metal. It was a secret buried for 16 years. In the summer of 1979, the blistering heat of Albuquerque clung to every building, every cracked sidewalk, and every restless dream that wandered the narrow streets of New Mexico. On the second floor of a faded corner cafe turned music lounge called the Rusted Note, 4 boys crowded around a single microphone. The tape recorder hummed, its wheels spinning with quiet intensity as the lead vocalist, Dean Carver, leaned in, his voice raspy from days of rehearsing under the desert sun. "This one's called Backroads Moonlight," he announced, before strumming the first chord. Dean, 23, was the reluctant leader of the group that would soon become known as the Marlins. His younger brother, Seth Carver, just 19 and fresh out of high school, played bass with a fierce intensity that belied his quiet demeanor. Tyler Kim, the curly-hailed guitarist with an ear for melody, was the one who had the idea to record their demo on a refurbished cassette deck, borrowed from a retired DJ. And then there was Marcus Bell, the drummer, the heartbeat, who never spoke much but knew exactly when to push the tempo and when to let a silence breathe. That summer there was no record deal, no manager, just a handful of gigs in the backyards of friends or in smoky diners where the only pay was leftover pie and cold beer. But it was enough. They believed in the music, and more than anything, they believed in each other. The recording, raw and imperfect, somehow caught fire. A local radio DJ named Marnie Soto picked it up from a dusty stack on. It was the twang in Dean's voice, the haunting harmony on the chorus, the way the song made you feel like driving down a highway with the windows down. She played it once during a midnight set. The phone lines lit up. Within weeks it was being passed around, tape by tape, making its way through towns that hadn't even heard of Albuquerque. By early 1980, the Marlins had a modest but fiercely loyal following. The songs weren't polished, they weren't industry ready, but they were real. And real was something people were starving for. It was at one of their first out-of-state gigs in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that they caught the attention of Elliot Mays, a small-time producer with a big-time attitude. Elliot wasn't from a major label, but he talked like he was. Promises of studio time, distribution, even a Cross-8 tour spilled from his lips faster than the ink dried on the napkin he scribbled their contract on. They signed it, all 4 of them. No lawyers, no second thoughts, just excitement and dreams and the belief that this was their shot. Still, true to his word, he got them into a studio in Norman and helped produce a 6-track EP titled Skybound Souls. The EP didn't chart. It didn't even get reviewed. But the fans, they came. College kids, truckers, single moms, night shift workers, they all showed up. They sang the lyrics back like they'd written them themselves. The Marlins began playing bigger venues. Their names started showing up in regional listings. Dean stopped waiting tables. Tyler dropped out of college. Seth bought new strings with money he didn't borrow. For the first time, it felt like the rest of the world was catching up to what they already knew. Yet for all the momentum, there was an unease that lingered under the surface. Elliot was hard to pin down. The royalties were vague. The money came but always a little late and never with paperwork. When Dean pressed him for clarity, Elliot would flash that grin and say, "Trust me, kid. Paperwork kills art." Tyler, more cautious than the others, began keeping copies of everything. Flyers, set lists, receipts. He didn't say why. He just did. By 1981, they were gearing up for their biggest move yet, a regional tour that would take them across 7 states, culminating in a showcase at a Portland venue that had recently hosted up-and-comers who were now national names. Rainlight Records booked the flights. All except one, Tyler, terrified of flying, insisted on meeting them by bus. It became a joke within the band. They were buzzing that day, March 18, 1983. Albuquerque to Portland, with a stopover in Reno. The private jet was modest but elegant, painted in navy blue, a small rainlight decal by the door. Seth had borrowed his brother's jacket. Marcus carried a notebook full of new drum patterns he wanted to try. Dean clutched a tape, just one, that he'd recorded the night before. A new song. One he hadn't told anyone about yet. They never made it. The jet vanished less than an hour after takeoff. One moment it was on radar, cruising at 28,000 feet over northern Nevada. The next, it was gone. No distress call, no emergency beacon, just static. The last radar ping placed the aircraft veering slightly off course toward the Oregon coast. News broke within hours. Missing over western skies. Rainlight Records released a single, brief statement expressing grief and confusion. Elliott disappeared from public view for weeks. Tyler, upon hearing the news at a bus depot in Salt Lake City, collapsed. He didn't speak for days. Fans held vigils, speculated, theories ran wild. But no trace was ever found. It was as if the sky itself had swallowed them. The morning of March 18, 1983, arrived with a hazy sun breaking over El Paso's distant desert ridges, painting the skyline with burnt orange light. The private jet, a 1976 Learjet 35A, waited at the west end of the tarmac at Franklin Regional Airfield, its engines humming softly, shimmering slightly from the early heat. Dean Carver arrived first, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and the same leather notebook he always carried tucked beneath one arm. Seth was close behind, looking drowsy but wired from excitement, humming a riff from their new track. Marcus showed up in his usual silence, nodding to the crew with polite reserve as he boarded. Elliott Mays wasn't there to see them off. He'd called late the night before with vague words of encouragement and a reminder to be ready for what's next. It was their first real tour, their first headlining performance in a city that mattered beyond the state line. Portland's Midnight Theater was a venue known for making careers, and Skybound Souls was finally going to have its live debut in front of music journalists, local critics, and a label scout from Tiacan. The stakes were as high as their adrenaline. The aircraft's captain, Richard Bowden, had logged over 1,000 hours in the cockpit of this exact model. He greeted the band members with a calm smile and a firm handshake, reassuring them about weather conditions. Clear skies all the way through to Oregon, tailwinds in their favor, estimate arrival time 2:05 p.m. local. The co-pilot, Helena Ortiz, was quiet but observant, tapping her checklist with efficient rhythm. The band made jokes as they buckled in, Marcus tapping beats against the armrest with his fingers, Dean sketching lyrics in the margins of his notepad, Seth snapping a Polaroid of the window view before takeoff. The moment felt important in ways none of them could quite articulate, like the beginning of something irreversible. The wheels lifted from the runway at exactly 10:04 a.m. Control tower logs later showed everything proceeded normally for the first 37 minutes. Altitude was stable, communications clear, airspeed within expected parameters. But then, at 10:41 a.m., something shifted. The jet made a slight banking maneuver north-northwest, unannounced, unscheduled. At first, the tower assumed it was a standard adjustment, possibly to avoid unexpected air traffic or turbulence. But by 10:46 IMH, the deviation had grown significant. The Learjet was now 180 miles off course, heading toward a remote patch of wilderness somewhere between Klamath and Deschutes National Forests. Controller Randall Hayes attempted to reach the pilot via standard channels. No response. Another 2 minutes passed, then 4. They switched frequencies, attempted a ping, scrambled secondary relays, nothing. At 10:52 a.m., the last known transponder ping registered at an altitude of 24,300 feet, noticeably lower than their previous cruising height. Then silence. Radar contact was lost entirely at 10:53 a.m. No mayday, no emergency beacon, no indication of catastrophic failure, just disappearing. Within 30 minutes, NORAD and the FAA issued an internal alert for a potential downed aircraft. El Paso Tower notified Rainlight Records, who in turn began calling venues, press agents, and the families. Tyler Kim, still en route via Greyhound and somewhere between Colorado Springs and Denver, was told by a panicked station manager during a call-in promo interview. His reaction was one of disbelief, an automatic denial wrapped in confused half-laughter, as if the man on the other end had confused the date or the band. Meanwhile, efforts to triangulate the Learjet's last position led to a flurry of calculations. The strange deviation in silence had turned what should have been a straight 3-hour flight into a question mark, suspended in thousands of square miles of forested terrain and coastal wilderness. Initial theories ranged from a loss of cabin pressure to electrical failure. But that didn't explain the reroute. Planes didn't just change course without a reason, and pilots didn't fall silent at 24,000 feet without leaving some kind of trace. That afternoon, the Oregon Civil Air Patrol launched 2 helicopters and a fixed-wing search craft to begin visual sweeps of the projected flight path deviation. No debris, no fire, no trail. Just pines and rivers and the low hiss of radio static. The first 72 hours passed in a blur. Media coverage went national. Up-and-coming indie band disappears over Oregon airspace. Dean's father appeared on a local Albuquerque news station holding up a school photo of the 2 brothers with red eyes and a trembling voice. Seth's mother refused to leave her kitchen, saying she'd be there when he came home. Fans began leaving cassette tapes, guitar picks, and hand-hat room their letters at the doorsteps of venues where the band had once played. One fan even mailed her copy of Skybound Souls to the Midnight Theater, asking them to keep it safe for when they arrived. Back at Franklin Regional, a routine inspection of the flight's maintenance logs turned up nothing unusual, except one oddity. The aircraft's navigational override setting had been manually disengaged before takeoff. This meant any course deviation would have had to be pilot-controlled or externally influenced. There was no autopilot malfunction to blame. The finding was noted but not publicly disclosed. Investigators labeled the incident unexplained, flight deviation with probable loss over unconfirmed terrain. Elliot Mays issued a vague press statement. The Marlins were a rising force, a bright light in the music world. We mourn them, we continue to search for answers. Then he disappeared from interviews entirely. Helena Ortiz's last recorded log entry was a casual remark written in her pilot's notebook. Fuel good, visibility clear. Band seems nervous but excited. It was dated and time-stamped 20 minutes before radar loss. Later that week, a second private search funded by a local music promoter yielded the discovery of an unmarked piece of fuselage washed up along the shore of Crater Lake. It was metallic, burnt at the edges, partially torn, but it lacked identifiers. The serial number plate had been removed. Officials downplayed its connection to the missing jet. The piece was sent to a military facility for analysis. No further updates followed. Meanwhile, somewhere deep in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, unreachable by radio or roads, the last signal of a Learjet blinked for the final time. Then, nothing. As days bled into weeks, the initial frenzy around the missing Learjet dulled into a hollow rhythm of unanswered questions and dead ends. What began as a coordinated emergency operation with helicopters from Oregon's National Guard and thermal drones from neighboring counties soon unraveled into chaos. Volunteers combed through dense forest outside Deschutes, hiking through bramble-covered trails, shouting the names of the band members into silent trees that offered no reply. Dog teams were flown in from California. A fleet of amateur pilots joined the search, mapping grid after grid of airspace and terrain from Roseburg to Bend. The authorities expanded the perimeter twice. Still, nothing. By the end of April 1983, 2 months had passed. The FAA classified the incident as aviation loss with probable fatality, but families refused to give in. Dean and Seth's parents set up a hotline in Albuquerque, taking turns sleeping near the receiver just in case. Marcus Bell's older brother hired a private search team, retired rangers and ex-cops, men who knew the region's wildest parts, but their satellite maps offered no new insight. Elliot Mays, ever elusive, kept a low profile, answering calls from the press with clipped responses. "We're devastated," he'd say, or "let the investigators do their work," but nothing more. He never once contacted the families directly. As May dragged on, fan forums began to overflow with theories. Some believed the plane had crashed into a hidden lake. Others suspected mechanical sabotage. A few whispered that maybe, just maybe, the disappearance was staged, that the band had faked their own deaths to escape contracts or fame. Tyler Kim, devastated and withdrawn, refused interviews. He reportedly spent days alone at the studio in Oklahoma, listening to old recordings and staring at the wall map, where he'd pinned each place the Marlins had ever played. A red string connected El Paso to Portland, then stopped abruptly cut mid-air. 6 months after the disappearance, the official search effort ended. No debris, no signal, no bodies. In October 1983, the Civil Aviation Board issued a final report with sterile language and inconclusive phrasing. Presumed loss over unconfirmed territory, it read, a bureaucratic tombstone for 4 young men who had once filled entire venues with their voices. But grief doesn't follow government timeline. It festers, folds into the cracks of memory, and in some cases, explodes. On a chilly evening in early November, a local journalist from Las Cruces Weekly ran a story that reignited public interest. It wasn't based on radar or satellite data. It came from a voice on a scratchy cassette tape. Leila Knox, a 22-year-old from Santa Fe, had once dated Tyler Kim during the band's early days. She'd never spoken publicly about their relationship, mostly out of respect for his family and the others. But that changed after she discovered a message he left on her answering machine the night before the flight. "I don't know, Lay," the voice crackled on the tape, faint with tension. "Something's wrong. This whole thing doesn't sit right with me. I keep getting this gut feeling, like we're being rushed into something. And the flight, I hate it. You know I hate flying. I didn't sleep last night. I've got this panic in my chest, like something bad is going to happen." The call had come in at 1:17 a.m., just over 8 hours before takeoff. Leila had saved the tape out of sentiment, never imagining it would one day become evidence of a mind unraveling before disaster. When pressed, Leila revealed more. Tyler had been increasingly anxious in the weeks leading up to the tour. He'd spoken of sudden changes in the itinerary, of Elliot insisting on the private jet instead of driving. He was paranoid, she said, but not crazy. He felt cornered. She remembered one night he came over, his hands shaking as he scrawled something in his lyric book, something about control, altitude, and silence. She no longer had the book. Tyler had taken it with him. Leila's story fractured the already fragile narrative surrounding the band's disappearances. Why had Elliot forced the group onto a jet if Tyler was so fearful of flying? And what did Tyler mean by being rushed? More unsettling, why hadn't the phone call been mentioned in any previous investigation? The families demanded the case be reopened. The FAA declined. There was no new physical evidence, just hearsay from a grieving ex. But for those who had lost someone on that flight, it was enough to crack the surface. Fans began to organize online campaigns, mailing letters to senators, holding vigils in each city the Marlins had visited. One of the most viral clips featured a Portland record shop owner playing a dusty cassette copy of Over the Water and choking up mid-sentence. They had something special. They didn't deserve to vanish like vapor. Still, the trail remained cold. No wreckage surfaced, no distress signal ever played. Local fishermen reported seeing flashes over the Cascade Range that day, but none could be verified. An aviation blogger from Chicago published a deep dive into regional weather data, suggesting wind currents may have pushed the jet further off course than initially thought. But his theory lacked hard proof. Without black box data or crash remains, speculation stood on air. Tyler's fear, once dismissed as nerves, now echoed with haunting clarity. His words, "Something bad is going to happen," lingered like a ghost through every rewatch of their old live shows, every playback of their final EP. To the fans, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a haunting, unresolved chord, one that begged for resolution but refused to resolve. 2 years had passed since the Learjet vanished into the Pacific Northwest skies, and yet for many, time hadn't moved at all. The official declaration of death came quietly, an envelope from the Office of Vital Records, postmarked March 22, 1985, arriving in 4 separate mailboxes across New Mexico and Arizona. The Carver family opened theirs with trembling hands. The air sucked from the room the moment Dean and Seth's names stared back from the form under presumed deceased. Marcus Bell's copy was delivered to a modest one-story house on the outskirts of Las Cruces, where his mother, Irene, stood at the mailbox, staring at the white envelope for several minutes before walking back inside and placing it, unopened, inside the top drawer of her nightstand. She never opened it. She never would. Every March after that, Irene ran a classified ad in the Las Cruces Sentinel. It always said the same thing: "To my son Marcus, if you are out there, know that your mother still believes. I will never stop looking. Love, Mom." Some years it appeared on the back page, other times it ran alongside auto listings and coupon offers, but without fail, it was there, a quiet scream pressed into cheap newsprint. The rest of the families grieved in their own fractured ways. Dean and Seth's parents moved to Colorado Springs, unable to walk the streets of Albuquerque without seeing ghosts. Tyler's younger sister began a blog in 1990, filled with lyrics and memories and photos of her brother making silly faces at the dinner table. The world kept spinning. Albums got released. New bands rose to prominence. But for a small group of people left in the wake of that plane's vanishing, life had split into a before and an after. Then, in the spring of 1991, something surfaced, not from the sea, but from a dusty shelf in a forgotten archive room behind station KZZR in Roswell. The station manager, a man named Edgar Lyles, was cleaning out backlogs of donated tapes when he stumbled upon a plastic case labeled in faded Sharpie. Inside was a Maxell cassette, the kind popular in the late 70s. Its label yellowed with time. Edgar didn't recognize the handwriting, but curiosity and boredom got the better of him. He popped the tape into a player, expecting a few rough demo tracks, maybe rehearsal outtakes. What he heard instead made him sit bolt upright in his chair. It was a song he'd never heard before, slow and reverberant, built on a minor chord progression that bled with tension. Dean's voice was unmistakable, calm but cracking, layered over an arrangement far more somber than their earlier material. Marcus's drums were subdued, almost heartbeat-like. Tyler's guitar welted fade, no one knows. The tape ran. 6 minutes and 38 seconds. At the end, there was no commentary, no studio banter, just static. Then it clicked off. Edgar called the station's programming director and played it over the phone. She was speechless. No one could trace who had dropped off the tape or when. The station logs from the 80s were incomplete, most handwritten and later tossed during a moving '89. Edgar spent days scouring inventory lists, calling old staff, and even reaching out to local college radio DJs, trying to piece together its origin. All dead ends. Still, the authenticity was unmistakable. A visiting audio engineer confirmed the analog hiss matched equipment used at the studio in Norman where Skybound Souls was recorded. The band's signature sound, their fingerprints on the instrumentals, the microphone hiss, all of it lined up. KZZR aired the track late one night in April 1991 during a segment called Lost Frequencies. It was introduced without fanfare with a simple voiceover, a lost recording from a lost band. This is Over the Water by the Marlins. The phone lines lit up instantly. Calls flooded in, some from fans who recognized the voices, others who had never heard of the band but were shaken by the song's atmosphere. One woman claimed it made her cry without knowing why. Another said it felt like a message, a whisper across time. Word spread quickly. The Carvers heard it through a friend and drove 8 hours overnight to get a copy. Irene Bell, now grayer, thinner, listened to it in silence before walking outside and sitting on her porch until the sun came up. Tyler's sister posted the lyrics online, and within days, message boards filled with speculation. Was this their final song? Did they know something? Was Over the Water a metaphor, a premonition, or a farewell? Among the theories, one detail stuck out. No official studio schedule ever mentioned a final session. Rainlight Records never acknowledged the track. Elliot Mays, when contacted, claimed ignorance. Must have been something they did on their own, he said in a brief phone interview. They were always recording stuff late at night. I let them have the keys. That's all I know. But Tyler had never recorded without logging the equipment used. He'd kept meticulous records of their studio time, track lists, even tape types. Yet Over the Water appeared in none of them. An anonymous comment left on one of the band's fan sites read, "That song wasn't supposed to be found." The message was deleted within minutes. Music critics praised the track as their most mature work, stripped of indie gloss and filled with raw, aching atmosphere. Rolling Sound magazine listed it as one of the top 10 lost songs of the decade. Vinyl bootlegs began circulating among collectors, but for the families, none of it felt like closure. If anything, it reopened a wound they had spent years trying to bandage. Why record something so haunting, so final just before boarding a flight? And who had placed it in that archive? The song's final verse offered little comfort, above the pines, beyond the flames / we called for help, but none came. Those who knew the band personally said the lyrics didn't match Dean's usual tone. There was no hope in it, only resignation. And still, no one could explain how the tape had arrived in Roswell, nearly 250 miles from Norman, with no postmark, no note, no timestamp. 8 years after the discovery of Over the Water, the song had faded from headlines, but it continued to echo in niche circles, vinyl collectors, indie music forums, and amateur sleuths dedicated to unraveling the mystery of the Marlins. Most of the world had moved on. The band's story had been reduced to a tragic footnote in regional music history, a curious anecdote told over bar counters or in late-night college radio slot. But far from public attention, deep beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, the truth had been waiting, silent, cold, buried beneath layers of time and salt. In the fall of 1999, the U.S. Navy initiated a seabed sonar survey 27 kilometers off the coast of Grays Harbor, Washington. The operation, officially a mapping mission for submarine training routes, involved state-of-the-art side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles. Equipped with high-resolution imaging, Lieutenant Commander Will Rhodes led the mission aboard the USS Tremont, a midship research vessel repurposed from its Cold War roots. On October 17th, during a routine grid sweep, sonar returned an anomaly at a depth of approximately 180 meters, a long, narrow object with angular features inconsistent with natural formations. The technician marked it as non-ceologic metallic and flagged it for review. It wasn't uncommon to find scrap on the ocean floor, old shipping containers, sunken fishing equipment, but this object stood out for one reason. The next day, the team deployed an ROV fitted with floodlights and a camera. As the feed flickered to life, images of cold green-blue silence filled the monitor, undisturbed silt, patches of anemones clinging to rocks, occasional glints of natural mineral deposits. Then the shape emerged, a curved edge unnaturally smooth, partially buried under decades of sediment. As the RV circled, more details became visible. A fragmented wing, with jagged tears across its surface, and the unmistakable arc of a jet turbine half-crushed under pressure. But what silenced the room was the emblem. Near the torn edge of what had once been the starboard wing, partially obscured by rust and marine growth, was a faded logo, a red chevron with a silver band beneath it. It was unmistakable to anyone familiar with aviation history. It belonged to North Hawk Aero, a small aircraft manufacturer whose branding had changed in late 1982 following a corporate merger. This logo had only been in use between 1974 and 1982. When the images were reviewed back on deck, Lieutenant Rhodes requested cross-conferences with the FAA. The tail section wasn't visible, and the serial plates, normally mounted near the rear fuselage, were either missing or covered by debris. But dimensions, paint, structural alignment all pointed toward a Learjet 35A, the same model flown by the Marlins. Rhodes didn't say anything publicly. Instead, he filed an internal report marked Level 3, Anomaly, Civilian Possible. A week later, the Navy authorized a limited recovery. The first piece brought up was roughly 1 meter long, covered in marine crust. Back at the Naval Lab in Bremerton, technicians began carefully removing layers of corrosion. The structure was confirmed to be an aileron section, part of the control surface from a wing. Embedded beneath layers of oxidation was the original alloy serial number, and just beneath that, the remnants of a decal, Rainlight Records' old booking emblem, applied by Elliott Mays for tour branding. The decal had weathered poorly, but it was enough. The conclusion, though not formally stated, was obvious. The wreckage likely belonged to the aircraft lost in March of 1983. The same flight that had carried 4 musicians into history's blind spot. When the story quietly made its way through the chain of command, the Department of Transportation was informed. A small, closed-door meeting took place in D.C., where representatives from the FAA, NGB, and the Navy convened. Public disclosure was debated but ultimately postponed pending further verification. The justification given was the lack of full fuselage of recovery and the impossibility of confirming remains. Unofficially, however, there was hesitancy. A decades-old case involving a music group with a cult following, mixed with unofficiated rumors and a suspicious production label, it wasn't a can of worms anyone wanted to open too quickly. Meanwhile, a civilian analyst named Dana Hewitt, who had been subcontracted for sonar analysis, recognized the logo from a music magazine she'd read in college. She quietly began digging. Cross-referencing the aircraft's specs with crash databases, she confirmed that the only registered Learjet 35A with that specific logo scheme reported missing in that sector was the one chartered by Rainlight Records in 1983. She printed the data, made copies, and sent one to a P.O. box in Las Cruces, addressed to Irene Bell. 3 weeks later, the envelope arrived in Irene's mailbox, unmarked except for a single note inside. They found something. Off the coast. Look at page 3. Irene, now nearing 70, sat on her porch and stared at the photographs for a long time. The wing fragment, the symbol, the rusted aileron's edge. She didn't cry. She went inside, pulled out the drawer where Marcus's unopened death certificate still sat, and placed the new envelope next to it. News didn't break for another month. It wasn't until a retired sonar engineer, frustrated by the lack of transparency, made still images to a marine archaeology forum that whispers began circulating. The story gained traction fast. Journalists, many of whom had covered the band's disappearance 16 years earlier, came knocking. Music sites, forums, and radio shows brought the case back into public consciousness. One of the images, the wing piece with the faded emblem, was plastered across fan pages bearing the caption, "Proof at Last." XZR and Roswell replayed Over the Water in tribute. Calls came in from listeners who claimed they always knew the band didn't just vanish. People began asking bigger questions. If this was the aircraft, why had it taken 16 years to find? Why that location, nearly 300 kilometers off their flight path? Why was no distress call sent? These theories revived, louder than before. Some pointed fingers at sabotage, others at pilot error or cover-up. A few recalled the lyric from Over the Water, "We drift and fade where no one knows." Back on the USS Tremont, the sonar scans were expanding. The full extent of the wreck hadn't yet been mapped. Larger pieces lay deeper, embedded in silt, distorted by decades of pressure. And as divers prepared for a second descent, questions above water began multiplying. When the images of the wreckage surfaced in late 1999, a fire reignited in someone who had never really stopped searching. Nathan Carver, older brother to Dean and Seth, had built a quiet life as a software engineer in Flagstaff. He rarely spoke publicly about his brother's disappearance, preferring instead to funnel his grief into private obsession. Maps, flight patterns, weather archives, and late-night rabbit holes that stretched across years. For him, the confirmation of aircraft debris off the Washington coast wasn't closure. It was a door finally unlocked. Within weeks, he hired a small team of independent aviation analysts, including 2 former NHFA consultants and a retired FAA radar technician. Funded by his own savings and a grant from a nonprofit specializing in unsolved transport disasters, the team began assembling every scrap of data they could recover from the original incident. One breakthrough came from a near-forgotten data storage facility outside Albuquerque, where archived radar data from 1983 had been transferred to digital format only 5 years earlier. It took weeks of processing, but when the cleaned radar imagery was finally reconstructed, one anomaly stood out immediately. At 10:41 a.m., exactly 12 minutes before the Learjet vanished, the aircraft was recorded flying at just 1,200 feet above sea level, barely skimming the ocean surface. This was nearly 23,000 feet lower than its previously logged altitude. The descent wasn't gradual. It had dropped rapidly and then maintained the dangerously low altitude for nearly 3 minutes before the signal cut out. There had been no distress call, no altitude correction, no indication that either pilot was attempting to regain normal cruising height. This low-altitude flight pattern had never been disclosed by the original FAA report, likely missed in the noise of early radar data processing, or perhaps deliberately omitted. Nathan, shaken, sent the data to the Navy and NB, but received only boilerplater's replies thanking him for his continued interest. Not content with silence, he turned to the last people who might remember what had happened that day on the ground: airport personnel. He tracked down employees who had been stationed at Franklin Regional Airfield on March 18, 1983, finding most retired or relocated, After dozens of calls, he reached a man named Gerald Knox, a former ground technician who had since moved to Gerald was reluctant at first, guarded, but something about Nathan's quiet persistence broke through. They agreed to meet in person at a small diner off Interstate 10. Gerald, now in his 70s, sat across from Nathan with a cup of coffee and a worn-out folder. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he began with a sentence that Nathan would later say, "Rewired everything I thought I knew." George said, "I remember the captain of that jet getting a phone call before takeoff. I thought it was weird because it wasn't through the tower, it was on a personal line, patched through the operations desk. That never happened." Nathan froze. "Who called him?" "I don't know, but I remember the operator saying something like, 'You need to take this. It's from Oklahoma.'" Gerald sipped his coffee. He was different after that. Quiet. Didn't say a word during final checks. Just nodded, clipped his headset on, and got in the cockpit. What time was the call? "Right around 9:20, maybe 9:25. Flight left just after 10, right?" Nathan nodded slowly. His mind raced. Oklahoma meant only one thing: Rainlight Records. Elliot Mays, the man who had vanished from interviews and reappeared only to deny everything. Could he have placed that call? Why? And why through a personal line? Gerald finally opened the folder. Inside was a copy of the day's operations log, not the official one, but a handwritten shift copy that ground staff used for cross-reference. Next to Learjet 712L in small pencil script was a note, "Opt patch in 924 X3. There was no record of the call's contents, but the fact that it happened at all had never been mentioned in any official documentation. Nathan took the file and digitized it that night, then uploaded it to his growing archive of evidence. Over the next several days, he traced XD through to the internal phone bank of the now-defunct Rainlight Records office in Tulsa. He confirmed this through a 1981 business directory listing published in a local industry zine. Though the office had long since been gutted and repurposed into a vape shop, the records remained archived in City Business Record. Every puzzle piece deepened the mystery. Why had the pilot received a private call from the label minutes before departure? What was said in that brief conversation that made him silent and withdrawn? And why had the plane dropped so low so suddenly with no sign of struggle? Nathan released a redacted report online under the pseudonym Project Delta Echo, outlining the new radar data and the airport phone call. Within weeks, aviation blogs picked it up. Independent journalists began circling. A podcast called Dark Flight dedicated 3 episodes to discussing the new information, interviewing Gerald Knox anonymously and discussing the possibility of pressure from Rainlight Records to reroute the plane. Then came the backlash. Anonymous emails began hitting Nathan's inbox, urging him to drop it or let the past die. One message simply read, "Some sounds were never meant to be replayed." Nathan ignored them, continuing to digitize and release what he found. For him, this wasn't about conspiracies. It was about Dean and Seth, about knowing what happened in those last minutes, about understanding why 4 boys full of hope and melody had disappeared in the sky, and why no one seemed interested in finding the truth. And still, the most unsettling detail was the radar curve itself, an arcing dive that seemed deliberate, not accidental. As if the jet had been forced down or guided low, but for what purpose? The answer, Nathan suspected, lay somewhere deeper, not just in the sea, but in the minutes between a phone call and the roar of an engine taking off down a sun-scorched runway in El Paso. Following Nathan Carver's release of the radar anomaly and the El Paso phone call logs, public pressure escalated to a point the authorities could no longer ignore. In early 2000, under mounting scrutiny from independent journalists and aviation safety advocates, the Navy authorized a new deep-sea mission to the debris site off Washington's coast. This time the objective was clear: recover the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, collectively referred to as the Black Box, from the sunken Learjet. The operation was led by Commander Lisa Trevorrow, a detail-focused officer with a reputation for precision and an aversion to speculation. The team aboard the USNS Dyer Ridge included forensic divers, sonar technicians, and a civilian investigator from the Transportation Safety Board, assigned quietly to avoid media coverage. On May 4th, the first substantial piece of cockpit wreckage was located, wedged beneath a collapsed portion of the fuselage, its edges twisted inward as if crushed on impact. Near it, partially obscured by sediment, was a rectangular orange cylinder, the voice recorder. It was intact, no signs of external damage, but when it was brought aboard and connected to recovery systems, the results sent a jolt through the entire team. The device had power terminals severed. The internal battery unit, a sealed lithium block designed to sustain recording functions even in emergencies, had been physically removed, not dislodged in the crash, removed. 4 screws around the access panel bore marks of a flathead screwdriver, each corner showing deliberate tampering. Commander Trevario stared at the technician's report for several seconds before simply stating, "This wasn't an accident." The civilian investigator, Julian Marks, filed an immediate internal alert. Per FAA protocol, removal or deactivation of a flight recorder's power unit constituted evidence of interference, potentially criminal. No such record existed in the aircraft's maintenance history. There was no authorization, no notation, no repair log to explain why the battery had been touched, let alone removed. When confronted, North Hawk Aero's defunct maintenance department, now absorbed into a larger aerospace firm, claimed the last official servicing of Learjet 712L occurred in late 1982 and did not involve the recorder system. They offered old documents but no further insight. The revelation hit the families hard. If the black box had been deliberately disabled before takeoff, someone had tried to ensure the plane's final moments would remain undocumented. But the most chilling discovery came next. During the third recovery descent, divers extracted a rear passenger seat from the aft cabin area. The seat, surprisingly well preserved, showed signs of violent displacement, its harness straps twisted and metal frame partially bent inwardly. More disturbingly, a dried reddish stain streaked across the right side armrest and pooled beneath the seat's cushion. Forensics on board took preliminary samples, later flown to a Department of Defense lab for testing. The results arrived 1 week later. The substance was confirmed to be human blood, but the DNA profile, though viable, matched none of the known samples provided by families of Dean, Seth, Tyler, or Marcus. Nor did it match the registered DNA of Captain Bowden or co-pilot Ortiz. It belonged to an unidentified male, estimated age range 30 to 45, genetic markers suggesting Hispanic descent. The database turned up no match. The revelation stunned the investigative team. Who was this person? Why had their blood been on the rear seat of a flight with 6 known passengers, none of whom matched the profile? Speculation ignited immediately. One theory suggested the plane had a 7th, unregistered occupant, someone hidden, someone not meant to be known. Perhaps a label executive, a security agent. Another suggested the blood had been transferred pre-flawn, but for maintenance analysis ruled out such passive contact. The pattern indicated active injury, possibly a struggle. The blood's age matched the time of the flight. Commander Trevorrow requested access to the original flight manifest filed by Rainlight Records, but was met with bureaucratic delays. The records, according to Rainlight's legal representative, had been lost in a warehouse flood sometime in 1987. Nathan Carver, now collaborating with a documentary crew chronicling the investigation, was furious. "They're hiding something," he told the camera, "and it started long before that jet left the ground." Meanwhile, journalists unearthed old invoices from Rainlight Records indicating that the Learjet was leased with discretion clauses, paperwork allowing for unnamed parties to board without formal registration. The pilot's logs were missing, and Elliot Mays, reached by phone, claimed ignorance. "I don't know anything about blood," he said. "You people are digging in places that were meant to stay buried." Then he hung up. No further contact was made. The presence of an unknown person on that flight changed everything. Investigators re-examined the aircraft's weight logs, noting a slight discrepancy, perhaps negligible at the time, but now, with hindsight, potentially proof. It appeared the plane had carried slightly more load than recorded, not enough to raise alarm, just enough for one extra body. The implications were staggering. Who was this person? Were they the source of the call to the captain before takeoff? Were they involved in the decision to reroute? Was their presence the reason the black box was disabled? No official answers were provided, but among those who had followed the case from the beginning, the pieces were beginning to suggest a far more sinister puzzle. And yet, the questions only deepened. Why had the plane dropped to sea level? Why was no Mayday call issued? And if someone had been on that plane who wasn't meant to be there, what happened to them? And why did their blood remain, but their identity vanish? The ocean had returned fragments, but the truth still drifted beneath the surface. As whispers turned to headlines, and headlines morphed into renewed public scrutiny, those who once profited from the Marlins' rising fame found themselves pulled back into the light, some willingly, others dragged. One of the names that resurfaced was Vincent Harrow, the original founder and executive producer of Blue Trail Records, the modest Albuquerque-based label that had first signed the Marlins in the winter of 1979. Harrow, a music industry outsider turned opportunist, was known for spotting regional talent and locking them into controlling contracts. He'd been in every recording session of the band's early work and was the first person to pitch their demo tapes beyond New Mexico. By all public accounts, he had been devastated by the band's disappearance, but what many didn't know, and what hadn't been widely reported, was that just 2 months after the flight vanished, Harrow himself disappeared. There was no press coverage at the time, no police report filed. He left behind a closed office, an emptied apartment, and a voicemail greeting that remained unchanged for years. His family in Nevada claimed they hadn't heard from him since April 1983. The only trace left behind was a withdrawn check made out to Rainlight Enterprises for an undisclosed leasing adjustment, dated March 27th, 9 days after the Marlins' flight vanished. Nathan Carver, upon learning this detail through a friend at the Arizona Arts Archive, immediately flagged the withdrawal. He cross-referenced it with bank logs acquired during a deeper dig into Rainlight's finances. The account number led to a short-lived subsidiary based out of Tulsa, shuttered in late '83, with no trace of Harrow's signature elsewhere. What did a licensing adjustment mean? And why would it occur posthumously for a band presumed lost at sea? As this financial thread unraveled, another, far more visceral, discovery surfaced. During the fifth ocean descent for wreckage retrieval, a small black carry-on bag was extracted from a sand-covered compartment beneath the mid-cabin. Its zippers had corroded shut, and the fabric clung to fragments of marine algae, but the interior remained intact, thanks to the sealed plastic within. Inside was a weathered, spiral-bound notebook, pages watermarked but legible, each lined with a careful, looping script. The bag was identified as belonging to Marcus Bell, the band's keyboardist and synth arranger. He had been known for obsessive documentation, melodies, dreams, lyrical fragments, chord progressions, and occasional poems about his stage anxiety. The notebook's last 10 pages stunned the investigation team. Scrawled in increasingly erratic handwriting were verses that didn't resemble songs but seemed more like confessions. One in particular stood out, lines that read, "We're not flying west anymore, they told us it's just weather, but the windows look down, and it's all ocean now, I feel the pull. Like magnets, I think we're being steered, not by wind, not by plan, but by something none of us asked for." Below it, underlined twice, was the phrase, "It's like someone wants us to disappear." Other pages referenced feelings of disquiet in the days before departure. Dean stopped smiling, Tyler barely touched his guitar, the captain wouldn't look at us before boarding, and finally, Marcus whispered something about not liking the way Elliot watched us at dinner. Though the tone could be interpreted as creative expression, the consistency with other testimony, Layla Knox's account of Tyler's midnight panic, the pilot's strange silence, and now the notebook's language, painted a pattern of unease. The timing of Harold's disappearance now took on new weight. If he had known something, perhaps about the routing or Rainlight's influence, had he been silenced, voluntarily vanished? Or did he flee before the fallout could reach him? The licensing adjustment payment remained the only verifiable trace he left behind. Music historians noted that shortly after Harrow vanished, all distribution rights for the Marlins' early tapes quietly transferred to Rainlight, even though contractually they should have remained with Blue Trail. The transfer was approved through a notarized signature, a signature later determined to be a forgery verified through handwriting analysis conducted by a private auditor Nathan commissioned in 2001. As these findings compiled, a theory emerged among Invicano investigators and journalists. What if the flight wasn't simply lost to weather or pilot error? What if it had been rerouted intentionally as part of a cover-up designed to protect commercial interests, music rights, asset control, and the erasure of inconvenient truths? Marcus's notebook, filled with eerie, reflective lyrics, seemed to anticipate something none of the members could fully name, but deeply feared. Lines like, "They say the clouds look like silence, and the air feels forced, heavy, like instructions," were not typical metaphors. They read more like live commentary, written in a cabin pressurized not just by altitude, but by dread. The final entry, written in pencil so faint it was nearly illegible, read, "We're flying into a curtain. If you find this path, tell someone we didn't choose this path." Forensic analysts verified the ink's age and the paper's authenticity. This was not a retroactive plant, not a dramatized recreation. It was the last thoughts of a young man hours before vanishing into the sea. Nathan kept a scanned copy taped to his apartment wall. He said it grounded him, reminded him that what he was doing wasn't obsession, it was responsibility. As all this came to light, Rainlight Records refused to comment. Their new ownership, having acquired the name but not the legacy, issued a terse statement disavowing knowledge of past operations. No answers came from Elliot Mays, who had by now moved to a private estate in Costa Rica, unreachable by legal summons. The silence from the label stood in stark contrast to the mounting voices of doubt, voices amplified by Marcus's own, scribbled into a notebook never meant to be read by anyone but himself. And yet, as haunting as the words were, they offered the clearest insight yet into what might have happened, not in the engines or the instruments, but in the decisions made before the wheels even left the ground. The closer Nathan Carver and his team came to assembling a timeline of events, the more apparent it became that someone, maybe more than one person, had tried very early on to blur the truth. It began with the manifest inconsistencies and deepened with the discovery of the missing voice recorder battery, Marcus's unsettling lyrics, and the unexplainable DNA on the cabin seat. Yet none of these explained the precise mechanical condition of the aircraft before departure, nor who had access to it in those final hours on the tarmac in El Paso. In February 2001, through persistence and luck, Nathan managed to track down Ronald Vega, a former certified aviation technician who had worked part-time contract shifts at Franklin's Regional Airfield during the early ADS. His name never appeared in the official documentation for the Marlins flight prep, something that initially ruled him out during earlier inquiries. But an anonymous call to a regional aviation podcast had mentioned a Ronnie V, who used to cover last-minute jet checks back in '83. Nathan followed the thread, and after weeks of emails and second-hand introductions, he met Vega in a quiet diner just outside Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Ronald, now retired and tending bees on a small patch of desert land, was cautious. He nursed a beer and stared at the window before speaking. "I remember the Learjet," he said slowly. "March '83, came in late, quick turnaround, not standard." When Nathan asked why his name never appeared in the official logs, Ronald sighed and reached into his coat. He pulled out a folder containing a photocopy of an inspection slip, dated March 18, 1983, with his signature at the bottom. "This is the original, the one I turned in, but that's not what the final report shows." Nathan was stunned. The official FAA aircraft log for that day, still publicly accessible, listed a different name, Thomas R. Lee, a technician from San Antonio. Ronald Vega had never worked with Lee, had never heard of him. Further analysis of the log showed subtle inconsistencies. The ink used for Vega's name had been overwritten. Digital magnification exposed pixel differences between lines. Someone had tampered with the record, digitally or during the original transcription. "I was paid cash," Ronald continued, "not through the airport. A guy from Rainlight called me personally. Said he wanted a second opinion on the avionics. Nothing crazy, just routine." When asked what he saw during the inspection, Ronald hesitated. "I remember one thing. The black box light was on when I stepped into the cockpit. It's not supposed to be. That system should be dormant until engine ignition. When I pointed it out, the captain, Bowden I think, brushed it off. Said it was a new wiring mod, but the wires were frayed, Nathan. Frayed, taped with electrical cloth. I wrote it up. That line was also removed from the final report." Nathan left the meeting with one clear conclusion. Someone at Rainlight Records or within the ground crew had both orchestrated and hidden a mechanical irregularity. The removal of Ronald's name and his findings was not accidental. It was part of a calculated effort to erase red flags before anyone could investigate. But erasures on paper could be contested. Photographic evidence, however, didn't lie. Later that spring, Nathan connected with a data archivist at the NASA Ames Research Center through an online forum for independent aerospace analysts. The archivist, intrigued by the case, agreed to sift through archived satellite imagery collected by NASA's experimental satellite program in the early 1000s. 980 or the satellites. Project TER-7 had been tasked with capturing atmospheric data over the Pacific Northwest during March 1983, due to a scheduled geomagnetic anomaly study. On March 18, 1983, at 10:54 a.m., minutes after the Learjet lost contact, a single frame captured a glinting object descending at an angle toward the water, approximately 280 kilometers off the Washington coast. The object's dimensions, determined via pixel calibration and atmospheric diffraction, matched the approximate silhouette of a Learjet. The frame, blurry and framed by cloud patterns, had sat untouched in a digital vault for nearly 18 years. No one had flagged it. It wasn't cataloged for aviation analysis. But there it was, an arc of light, a faint trail, and the curvature of an aircraft slicing toward the ocean. The coordinates were almost identical to the Navy's recovery site. When Nathan cross-referenced the timecode and position, he found less than a 3-minute discrepancy between the last radar ping and the satellite's visual record. The image was shared with aviation analysts who confirmed its plausibility. Given the trajectory and scale, one wrote, this is the first physical corroboration that matches both radar disappearance and wreckage location. But perhaps more importantly, it undermined the official FAA narrative, which had long insisted that no physical evidence of the crash existed for years following the disappearances. Nathan published the frame on his investigation site alongside Ronald's inspection slip. The backlash was immediate. Media outlets that had previously treated the Marlins' disappearances a romantic tragedy now reopened coverage with phrases like "Encinita sabotage." A new wave of attention surged through music and conspiracy forums alike. Fans speculated about motive. Was it to silence the band? Was it financial? A rights power grab? Some wondered if the extra passenger whose blood had stained the cabin seat was tied to this decision-making, possibly involved in overseeing the redirection of the flight. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, official agencies remained mostly quiet. The FAA issued a brief statement saying, "We are reviewing newly surfaced documentation and satellite data as part of an ongoing archival audit." Nothing more. Rainlight Records declined all interview requests. The music world, once enamored with the legend of a band lost to mystery, now began to understand that what had seemed like a tragic fluke was more likely the result of deliberate manipulation. And as Nathan stared at the satellite frame one final time, at that tiny metallic curve diving through the atmosphere like a blade through water, he couldn't help but ask again, who changed the name in the file, and what else had they covered up? With the revelations piling up and public attention mounting, the recovery team returned for one final descent in late June 2001, this time focused solely on the cockpit. The remaining debris had shifted slightly due to recent underwater activity, revealing a partially crushed control column and 2 mangled pilot seats, one of which still bore the faint imprint of a harness buckle. It was during the cautious removal of the left side pilot seat, the one occupied by Captain Bowden, that a small object dislodged from beneath the seat base and floated upward in a delicate cloud of silt. A diver caught it mid-raise. A black leather-bound notebook, its clasp rusted but intact, and the pages were swollen with seawater and decay, but restoration efforts back on deck allowed several entries to be recovered. The handwriting was determined to be Bowden's by a forensic linguist, who compared it with FAA training documents from his pilot certification. One entry, scrawled hastily across a salt-stained page near the back, read, "They changed the route before we left. I didn't file it. Someone else did. This wasn't pilot error. Someone knew. Someone planned." Another, even more disturbing, was written vertically along the inside cover. There was a voice in my headset. It wasn't ATC, repeating, "Stay low, redirect." I tried to respond but heard only static. But it was the final line, pressed hard into the paper as if carved, that froze every member of the recovery team. This wasn't the captain's decision. The notebook was photographed, documented, and quietly passed to the civilian branch of the Transportation Safety Board. No public announcement was made. The Navy, now treading carefully under a glare of scrutiny, confirmed only new materials had been recovered and were under forensic review. Nathan Carver, through his contacts, received a scanned image of the most damning page. He published it immediately on his site, where it spread like fire. The response was immediate and furious. Thousands demanded an official explanation. If the pilot hadn't charted the route, and if ground logs were forged, then who had orchestrated the deviation that sent 6 people, including 4 rising musicians, into the ocean? As mounting pressure reached Capitol Hill, a special review board was formed under the Department of Transportation and the Department of Defense. Closed-door sessions were held in August. Journalists, lawyers, and investigators were shut out. No footage, no transcripts, and no minutes were released. What did leak, however, came through an assistant analyst from the audit team, who anonymously disclosed that several documents relating to the flight path and maintenance logs had been marked classified. Review 2035. When questioned, the agency issued a vague statement. Certain operational details from that time intersect with unrelated national programs and are currently protected under legacy security protocols. It was the kind of answer that said everything by saying nothing. The phrase "unrelated national programs" lit up forums and newsrooms across the country. What program could possibly intersect with a regional band's charter flight? Why would a missing Learjet, a broken black box, and an unexplained reroute fall under military secrecy? Even more frustrating was the report finally issued by the Joint Civil-Military Investigation Board in December 2001. It was 83 pages long, filled with technical language, but its conclusion boiled down to one sentence. Due to inclusive physical evidence and procedural inconsistencies, the official cause of the 1983 Learjet 712L disappearances remains undetermined. No agency claimed fault. No further criminal inquiries were opened. The blood on the rear seat remained unidentified. The unknown caller to the pilot's headset remained unexplained. Ronald Vega's inspection was not acknowledged, and Marcus Bell's notebook was dismissed as creative expression without evidentiary value. The official narrative, revised quietly on the FAA's archived page, stated, "But those who had seen the leather notebook knew better. Those who had read Marcus's final lyrics knew better." Nathan Carver, exhausted but unrelenting, stood on a small stage in a community hall in Santa Fe on the 18th anniversary of the crash and read Bowden's final note aloud to a crowd of nearly 100, family, friends, old fans. A single microphone, a dim spotlight. He didn't ask for justice anymore, just acknowledgement. "We don't need conspiracies," he said. "We don't need theories. We have the pilot's handwriting, we have the radar, we have the truth." And we were told to forget it. Afterward, a young woman approached him. She wore a faded Marlins tour shirt from 1982 and clutched an envelope. Inside was a photograph her father had taken from a charter plane off the Oregon coast that same morning in 1983. The photo, faded and grainy, showed nothing conclusive, just sky, sea, and a faint line of cloud. But in the lower right corner, if tilted at the right angle, was a tiny, curved white streak. She said he never knew what it was. He died believing it was lightning. Nathan thanked her and placed the photo in the growing archive, now 5 boxes deep, stored in climate-controlled conditions, with backups in 3 locations. One of them, labeled Flight 712L, Civilian Evidence, bore a red sticker on the side that read, "Open in 2035. If this story left you with questions, theories, or chills, don't just keep them to yourself. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next mystery we uncover. Like the video if you want more real, haunting stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, what do you think really happened to Flight 712L? Which twist shocked you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? We read every comment.